Well, in world news today, there's been a major announcement by President Trump that has serious implications for the security of the Middle East region. And given its history as a hotbed of terrorist activity, training and radicalisation, it's got implications for countries further afield in the West too, like Australia. In a move opposed by not only military figures, the US State Department, but also many key Republicans as well, the President announced that the US forces in northern Syria would be moved aside in advance of a planned Turkish military offensive, effectively giving Turkey the green light to attack the formerly US-backed Kurdish forces. I was working in the then Prime Minister's office when Australia took the decision to send military support to the Middle East to fight Islamic State and later special forces to train up Iraqi soldiers. A key component in the defeat of Islamic State was the Kurds. And sadly, there's a real sense here with this decision that we're abandoning them to the expansionist might of Turkish President Erdogan. I'm also concerned, I have to say, for the possibility that Turkish forces may release Islamic State fighters currently held in prison by the Kurds. Joining me now for his analysis is foreign editor for The Australian, Greg Sheridan. I know it's difficult for the President because often the US carries the can around the world and not many other partners join with them. But I've got concerns, particularly in relation to the Kurds and how they'll be treated by the Turks with this decision. What's your take on it, Greg?
Well, I think you're right to have those concerns, Peter. So I'm someone who thinks Trump has turned out better than we feared, not as good as we hoped. And this decision is troubling. It's genuinely troubling. I say that as someone who's not hysterically anti-Trump at all. The Kurds have bled for the Americans. The Kurds are the most pro-Western force anywhere in the Middle East apart from Israel. I did a long piece or series of pieces on the persecution of Christians in Iraq and Syria, and one of the only places Christians could flee and not be killed was to the Kurdish areas. The Kurds are Muslims too, but they didn't persecute the Christians. The Christians were safe there until they could move on somewhere else. Now, I understand Trump wants to bring his troops home.
And he would say that's an election commitment, so I understand his imperative there.
Absolutely. It is just barely possible that the Turks were calling his bluff. Where I have some sympathy for Trump is this. The Americans only have about 1,000 troops in northern Syria. That's not a militarily significant number. They're only there as a tripwire. They're there so the only people who are silly enough to attack them are stateless terrorists. Anybody who has a return address will not attack American troops because they'll get smashed by the Americans if they do. Now, that all rests on a kind of a bluff because much as I admire the Kurds, it's probably the case that no American president would actually have gone to war for the Kurds. So did the bluff become unsustainable? Maybe the Turks had called his bluff. But on the other hand, there's also a chaos about this decision, which is typical Trump, but it's not good in this case because America's allies have their lives on the line. So Trump has had a phone call with Erdogan, he's announced the withdrawal, and then 5 minutes later, all of his Republican allies, not people who are anti-Trump, Lindsey Graham and so forth.
Yes, I've got some tweets. I'll put them up on the screen so people can just read. The comments have been very, very strong against the President over this decision, and they really, as you did at the start, really feel that they've let down an ally who has been there in the thick of it with them, the Kurds.
And then you get these very strong, as you say, comments from the Republicans. You also then get the Pentagon saying, well, no, actually, this is not a change of policy. We're just withdrawing a few hundred guys into a safe space. There's no change of policy. And then you get President Trump saying, if the Turks do one mean thing to the Kurds, I'm going to destroy and decimate their economy. Now, even allowing that Trump uses very exaggerated rhetoric and you've got to sort of, dial down your interpretation, this is a chaotic way to deal with the lives of hundreds of thousands of America's allies, plus also, as you rightly put in your intro, 10 or 12,000 ISIS fighters. We don't really know who's going to have custody of them.
That's my grave concern. There is a sense in reports that I read, particularly in the international media, that ISIS is beaten but not dead, and there's certainly enough of them locked up in places we hope that they stay locked up. At the moment, we certainly have the upper hand, but they came from nothing and they were incredibly good at mobilising, radicalising, disseminating, using technology to disseminate their message. So I don't doubt they could come back hard again.
Well, look, the Kurds have custody of perhaps 12,000 ISIS fighters, and they also have charge of a refugee camp with tens of thousands of civilians, many of whom are connected to the ISIS fighters. Now, if you just let 12,000 ISIS fighters back out all over the place, you don't know if some of them will go back through Turkey to Europe, if some of them will go back to America, if some of them will come back to Australia. So you want to have a good plan for how you do that. And at first, the President tweeted these people would be the responsibility of Turkey, as though there would be a peaceful handover. But on the other hand, Turkey is planning, as far as we can tell, to attack the Kurdish areas, so there's not going to be a peaceful handover. And then the President said, well, they'll be the responsibility of Turkey and Russia and Iran and Iraq and everybody else. And now, I understand that Trump achieves a lot with method where it looks like chaos, but I'm really worried that this time it's just chaos that looks like chaos.
And, of course, President Erdogan, we've talked about him before. He's the Turkish president. He is, well, I've sat in a room with him. Two other people were in the room for an hour or so, and I find him probably the most sinister of figures I've met in my life. I wouldn't trust him to have custody of these ISIS fighters, and I would be concerned. Yes, he's a NATO partner, but I would be concerned that Trump's got anything that he could come back at Erdogan if he doesn't meet the conditions of this withdrawal deal.
Yeah, apparently a number of these ISIS fighters, but certainly over the years, quite a large number of ISIS fighters, thousands and thousands, went through Turkey into Syria.
Yes.
And you're right, you wouldn't trust Erdogan. Now, I also have more sympathy than most commentators with Trump's feeling that he can't, you know, America can't micromanage every bit of the world. But
and look, I agree with that. I agree with that. And I understand his election commitment. He's in the election cycle. All of this stuff matters. But I don't know that this is the decision where he lets bad judgment or bad decision-making rest on the virtue of meeting an election commitment.
And also, it seems, again, that he's made a very consequential decision out of a phone call. Now, I mean, no leader influenced by you ever fell for this canard, but some leaders really think they make a phone call, they have a meeting, there's a bit of personal chemistry, and Yahoo, everything's great. Now, you know, Trump is a cynical old, you know, Manhattan real estate mogul. He does seem to fall for this sense that he can make a binding deal. But why would he think that Erdogan would be bound? Now, you could still withdraw American troops, but much better to do it in some orderly way. Here's a final reflection for you in a way, Peter. The way, and this is not all Trump's fault, the way the normal sinews of American power, the State Department, the Pentagon, have become, the intelligence agencies, have become alienated and disconnected from Trump. Partly Trump's fault, partly their own fault. Partly their own fault for not serving their president properly. But that has meant that he tries to do things himself, whereas in fact it would be much better for him to operate through a compliant State Department and Pentagon.
Just before we go, the Defence White Paper, there's been some debate in Australia in the media today that it needs to be revisited. It's not that old, but that tells you how fast things are moving.
It sure does. Look, I think Linda Reynolds gave a good speech today, but we need a lot more than speeches. I interviewed the French head of Naval Group and he told me a startling thing. The Chinese build, what was it, a new frigate every month, a new submarine every 3 months. We produce a new white paper every 3 years or so. In the time that it takes us to produce...
And decades to produce one submarine.
Decades to produce, yep. So under the Abbott government, we were going to get new subs in the mid-2020s. We're now not going to get them until the early 2030s, the first of them. And I just don't think there's enough urgency. We'll probably be all right because the Americans will look after us. But I just think that is... It's like visiting the United States and not having health insurance. This is just such a dangerous way. Yeah, but this is such a dangerous way for us to run our country. We are rich because of iron ore and the rest of it. We are a bit lazy, and we're quite a bit lazy about national security. I support the government's naval shipbuilding program. That's great, much better than nothing. And, you know, Labor's period in office gave us absolutely nothing. But I just don't think it's enough. Good speech from Linda Reynolds today. I'd like to see some urgency about actual action in this defence space.
Yeah, and I'd like to see both of them, the Defence Minister and the Foreign Minister, do a bit more media and a bit more accountability on some of these big issues, but I'm sure
I'm with you there.
You're of the same view. I tell you what, aren't you glad we've got that foreign fighters legislation to stop them coming back to Australia? At least there's a bit more arsenal there for the government if they were to move once the Kurds, I fear, will be run over by the Turkish military onslaught headed their way now that the US troops are withdrawn.